well aware that this is, as I said before, just a tiny pinprick of a story about one soldier, but I think it represents thousands of ordinary men and also thousands of civilians, old and young, men and women, children, that are affected by this terrible war and all other wars. This is the tiny pinprick of a story about a soldier who was one of thousands on the landings here in Termoli, my father. The father who was killed just before I was born, and a father I knew nothing about. When I was 14 and needed my birth certificate for a little part-time job in a local store, my mother was reluctant to give it to me. Finally, she simply said, "I have something to tell you. Your dad is not your real dad. Your dad was killed in the war." I'm afraid as a 14-year-old it meant nothing to me, and I couldn't wait to tell my friend next day that I had a stepdad. Ray, a stepdad. Life carried on as normal, and I didn't give it a second thought. Of course, the reticence of my mother was due to the fact that my real father's name was quite clearly visible on the certificate. My stepfather had never legally adopted me. That was it. Nothing was mentioned again, and I felt that I couldn't question my mother any further or anyone else in the family. I have to say that this was not unusual for the time. I have in recent years spoken to quite a few people with the same experience. As sad as it is, people in those days in England thought it best to just try and forget and carry on with life. The war was never mentioned, and I don't remember it being taught in school. I grew up oblivious to the horrors of that war, as did my friends. When I was 20, I travelled around the continent for months with a friend in her Mini. We spent a whole month in Italy, taking in the wonders of this beautiful country: Rome, Florence, Pisa, Naples, Pompeii, etc. I feel ashamed now that we didn't think once about the devastation and impact the war had on this beautiful country, less than 20 years before. What's more, nobody in the family thought to tell me that my father was buried in this land. I spend my days now contemplating all this and how this could be. When my mother died in 2020, I started to search for my father's family and found lovely relatives who welcomed me with open arms and were eager to tell me all they knew about my father and grandfather. A grandfather? Why hadn't I thought about that? It seems my roots are in the northeast of England, Easington Colliery, a once thriving colliery town. My grandfather is a coal miner. He lost his wife, my grandmother of course, when she was only 32, followed 4 weeks later by his 14-year-old daughter. Both died of tuberculosis. He was left with his 9-year-old son, my father, George. When my father was older, it was deemed best that George went south to find work rather than work in the dangerous mines. It was there that he met my mother and they eventually married. In May 1940, he volunteered and was signed up with the Territorial Army, and this is where his life changed forever. According to his records, he spent the time from 16th of May 1940 and to the 11th of August 1942 on special hardening training in various parts of England and Scotland. On the 12th of August 1942, he was posted to the Royal Ulster Rifles, but still training in England. On the 12th of August 1943, he finally set sail overseas and disembarked somewhere, I'm not quite sure, where, because the records aren't very clear to me. However, it is clear that he landed in Sicily on the 6th of September 1943 and was transferred immediately to the 1st Battalion of the Royal Irish Fusiliers. And here I refer to the actual handwritten regimental diaries. Handwritten, it's hard to imagine, daily reports and hour by hour on some days, huge sheets of paper. And this is what I've got, this is what I've got here. I'm not going to read it all to you, you'll be pleased to know that this, all handwritten. Oh yeah, where am I? No. Oh yes. I see for September the 6th it reads, a quiet day, training continued according to programme. Some reinforcements, Lieutenant Franklin Vale and JCG Glennie joined. Of course, this is my father, but he wouldn't be mentioned by name, a lowly fusilier. I see that Lieutenant Colonel B.H. Butler, DSO, was in command. He was sadly killed at the Trinio in October, along with John Glennie. I often wonder what my father thought when he arrived in sunny Italy, the hard fighting over for those who had fought and survived the Battle won. Hard training still, but cinema, concerts, even a swimming gala. It must have seemed like some sort of holiday camp. On the 23rd of September, movement commenced and they were on the march reaching Milazzo at 2200 hours, where they camped on the roadside. At 10 a.m. on the 24th, the battalion embarked on HMS Prince Leopold at West Beach and set sail at 1400 hours, arriving at Taranto at 10 a.m. on the 25th after a smooth crossing. I believe pipers of the Irish Brigade piped the brigade across the Straits of Messina. Imagine that. Again, I picture my father, or a father I never knew, still no battle for him. It must have seemed like a sunshine cruise in peacetime round the toe of Italy and across the Bay of Taranto. What was in store for him? I like to think he thought about my mother. He would have known that she was pregnant. Was she carrying a little boy or a little girl? A few days were spent in Valletta before the order was given to move to Termoli. For my father, it was countdown to experiencing real war for the first time. After the unreal sunshine cruise. By this time, it was raining, which didn't help the mood. At 2010, on the 5th of October, they reached Termoli Harbour, having had a smooth voyage. However, enemy shells are landing in the town. This is an unpleasant situation. It meant that the Irish Brigade were disembarking in what could be the front line. However, Brigadier Nelson Russell drew some consolation from the fact that his brigade is coming ashore at the rate of 300 every 90 minutes, and should the Germans enter the town, the Irish battalions were battle-hardened with street fighting experience from Centuripe. Every time I read this account, I think, not my dad. By 2200 hours, they were concentrated above the harbour in a narrow street, and I often wonder which one exactly. By the 7th, they had advanced via the station and the old brickworks where fighting took place. Then they took over the right half of the San Giacomo Ridge. And so, fighting all the way to the Trinio, he survived the battle there where so many good men were killed. He also survived the Sangro River battle, but his life ended just outside San Vito. According to the records, my father had been killed on the 2nd of December in San Vito. So for a number of years I walked around San Vito wondering where exactly he had lost his life. I think it was 2010 that, quite by chance, I was introduced to Vito Rulo, a lovely man in his early 80s at the time. On telling my story, he simply said, "But I was there. I will take you to the place." It was just outside the town, in the north side of the ravine, in a vineyard. I knew that the headquarters had been set up on the south side of the ravine in an old farmhouse, and that a patrol had gone into the town where fighting had taken place. I always assumed my father was part of that patrol. Vito witnessed, as a child, 4 soldiers coming across the vineyard to be confronted by German soldiers camping under the nearby olive trees. He saw 1 soldier killed. Was that one my dad? I don't know. And 2 German soldiers. This all makes sense now, as my father's records show that he was buried with 3 other soldiers from the same regiment in a temporary grave, along with 2 German soldiers. The map reference given on his records shows the location to be quite close. My father and the other 3 soldiers lie side by side in the Sangre River cemetery. I wonder who the Germans are, and wouldn't it be nice to find their descendants. I visit Vito and his family every year, but for the chance meeting with this lovely man, I would still be roaming around the streets of San Vito every year, wondering where my father was killed. That's it. I'm well aware that this is, as I said before, just a tiny pinprick of a story about 1 soldier, but I think it represents thousands of ordinary men and also thousands of civilians, old and young, men and women, children, that are affected by this terrible war and all other wars. Thank you, grazie.